A millionaire hires a maid who looks identical to her. Their shared past reveals a secret that changes everything. The rain beat down on the tempered glass windows of the Bennett mansion, dripping like heavy tears that slid under the pale light of the street lamps. The scent of the humid Miami air mingled with the soft aroma of polished wood and aromatic candles that filled the main hall. Victoria Bennett, sitting in a leather armchair near the fireplace, kept her eyes fixed on an undefined point in the room, but her mind was far away. With an untouched glass of wine in her hand, she listened to the crackling of the fire, which seemed to be the only living thing in that vast, silent space. At 30, Victoria had what many would call a perfect life. She was an investment magnate, the owner of $1 million empire, and one of the most imposing mansions in Miami. But deep down, it was all an empty stage. Ever since her adoptive parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier, she had lived with a silence that seemed bigger than the house itself. The knock on the parlor door brought her back to the present. Mrs. Berta, her housekeeper, entered with quick steps that echoed across the marble floor. "Mrs. Bennett, the candidate for the position of maid, has arrived. She's waiting in the entrance hall." Victoria sighed. Another interview that would probably be a waste of time. "Send her in." The housekeeper's footsteps moved away, and Victoria squared her shoulders, composing her serious, impenetrable expression. When the door opened again, it was as if time had stopped. The young woman who entered had features that looked like they had been taken from a mirror. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was an identical image, as if a simpler, more unpretentious version of Victoria was standing in front of her. "Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day." The young woman wore modest clothes and carried a worn cloth bag, but her eyes, large and expressive, shone with a mixture of anxiety and determination. "What's your name?" Victoria asked, her firm voice hiding the impact she was feeling. "Maria Suarez, ma'am." The answer came calmly, but there was something in her tone that indicated tiredness, as if that simple presentation was the result of an internal battle. Victoria took her time answering. She felt a strange vibration in her chest, as if something was out of place. But she couldn't give way to emotion. She reached out to take the CV Maria was carrying and began to read it, but the words seemed jumbled before her eyes. "You're hired," she said suddenly, handing the paper back without even finishing reading it. Maria's eyes widened. She hadn't expected such a quick decision. "Thank you, Mum. You won't regret it." Victoria nodded, dismissing her with a gesture for Mrs. Berta to show her to her rooms. When the door closed, Victoria looked back at the window, where the rain continued to fall. But now she couldn't see the rain. She saw Maria's face and the questions it brought. That evening, as the wind blew through the palm trees in the garden, Victoria went to the office that belonged to her adoptive father. The dark wood of the room exuded the scent of nostalgia, and every object seemed to be filled with memories. Sitting down in her leather chair, she began to rummage through documents, not knowing exactly what she was looking for. Then she found it. Among financial records and old letters, there was a birth certificate that seemed out of place. Her heart raced as she read the printed name, Maria del Carmen Lopez. Something inside her broke. She had always known that there were secrets about her origin, but she had never wanted to face them. Now that name echoed in her mind like an enigma. She looked at the certificate, then at her reflection in the office mirror. The questions she hadn't asked in years finally emerged. On the other side of the mansion, Maria was settling into the small room that had been assigned to her. It was simple but comfortable, with light furniture and the fresh scent of freshly laundered linen. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she held her locket between her fingers, feeling the symbolic weight of that object. Her biological mother had left her that necklace before she disappeared, a memento that was both a comfort and a curse. Every time she looked at it, Maria wondered who she really was and why she had been left in an orphanage. As she ran her fingers along the worn chain, she couldn't get Victoria out of her mind. "Why does she look so much like me?" she thought. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, but it didn't make sense. They belonged to such different worlds. Victoria, with her mansion and haughty air, was everything Maria would never be. Over the next few days, their relationship was marked by an almost palpable tension. Victoria watched her from afar, intrigued, while Maria did her best to concentrate on her work. But the young woman noticed the glances, the way Victoria seemed to study her, as if she were trying to solve a mystery. One afternoon, while Maria was cleaning the furniture in the main hall, Donna Berta came in carrying a silver tray. When her eyes fell on the medallion hanging from Maria's neck, the tray almost fell out of her hands. "Where did you get this?" Berta asked, her voice breaking. Maria stopped what she was doing and looked at the housekeeper, confused. "It was the only thing my biological mother left me. I don't know where it came from." The old woman turned pale. Her eyes filled with tears, but she looked away before Maria could ask any more. "That locket, it's the same as the one Mrs. Bennet's mother wore," she murmured before hurrying away. Maria was paralyzed. The sound of Berta's words seemed to echo in her mind, each syllable reverberating like a bell. The locket swayed around her neck as she took a deep breath, trying to process what she had just heard. Victoria, who had heard the conversation hidden behind a door, felt a chill. What had begun as a suspicion now seemed to be turning into something bigger. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together, but she still couldn't see the full picture. The days turned into a succession of silences and glances at the Bennet mansion. Victoria, tormented by the discovery of the name on the birth certificate and the uncanny resemblance to Maria, was torn between the need for answers and the fear of what she might discover. For her part, Maria was increasingly aware of the tension in the air, but harbored her own anxieties. The feeling that she was linked to that woman in an inexplicable way made her days at the mansion heavier than she had ever imagined. One morning, while the warm Miami breeze made the palm trees sway in the garden, Maria was called into Victoria's office. The atmosphere in the room, impregnated with the smell of leather and aged paper, seemed even more oppressive than usual. Victoria, dressed impeccably in a white suit, looked at Maria as if she were about to interrogate her. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice firm and unruffled. Maria obeyed, settling herself on the edge of the chair as if she didn't want to take up too much space. Her fingers played nervously with the medallion hanging around her neck. Victoria noticed the gesture, and the sparkle of the blue stone caught her eye once again. "This necklace," Victoria began, hesitating for a moment. She stood up and walked over to a shelf full of old photo albums. She took out one of them and, after flipping through a few pages, stopped at a black and white image. "Do you recognize this?" Maria looked at the photograph. Her eyes widened when she saw a young woman smiling, wearing a locket identical to her own. She instinctively put her hand to her neck, as if she needed to confirm that the object was still there. "It's the same, but that's not possible. Who is this woman?" Maria asked, her heart racing. Victoria closed the album tightly, as if she wanted to end the conversation before it began. "That's my adoptive mother," she replied, her voice filled with something between frustration and vulnerability. She was wearing a necklace exactly like that. Maria wanted to ask more, but Victoria had already turned away, looking out of the window with a distant gaze. "I need time," Victoria murmured. "You can leave." That night, as the cars passed in the distance on Miami's busy avenues, Maria couldn't sleep. She held the locket tightly, as if it could offer her answers. The simple room she was in seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with memories of her childhood. Maria remembered the orphanage where she grew up, the cold nights when she cried silently while other children slept. She remembered the few times someone came to visit her, and how she always waited in vain for a mother or father to come and get her. The locket was all she had, but it had never given her the answers she was looking for. Now, however, it seemed to be a piece of something bigger, something that was about to be revealed. In the office, Victoria couldn't rest either. The photo of her adoptive mother wearing the locket was on her mind, as were Maria's words. There was a mystery there, something Victoria knew she couldn't ignore. The next day, Victoria made a decision. She put her usual coldness aside and decided to confront Maria directly. "Maria, I need your help to understand something. If you don't mind, I'd like you to tell me about your childhood." "About your family?" Victoria asked, trying to hide the discomfort she felt at opening up like this. Maria hesitated. It wasn't easy to talk about her past, about the wounds she carried, but something in Victoria's tone made her trust her. "There's not much to tell," Maria began with a sad smile. "I was taken to an orphanage and lived there until I was 16, when I started working as a seamstress." I never knew anything about my family. All she left was this locket. Victoria was silent for a moment. Maria's words echoed in her mind, resonating with memories of her own doubts about her origins. Finally, she spoke. I think we have more in common than we realize. Maria looked up, puzzled. What do you mean? Victoria hesitated, but decided to tell her. I recently found out that I was adopted. And the necklace you're wearing. My adoptive mother had one just like it. I don't know what it means, but I think we need to find out. Maria felt a shiver run down her spine. Victoria's words were both frightening and revealing. Was it possible that this encounter wasn't a coincidence? Over the next few days, the two began to investigate together. Victoria went through her adoptive parents' documents, while Maria revisited her own memories, trying to remember any detail that might be useful. During one of these searches, they found something that changed everything. An old letter hidden in an envelope alongside other papers. The letter was addressed to Henry Bennett, Victoria's adoptive father. In it, a woman called Rosa Lopez explained, in shaky letters, that she had given one of her daughters up for adoption because she couldn't raise them on her own. Daughters, Maria whispered, her hands shaking as she held the letter. Victoria read the text again, her heart racing. Everything made sense now. The resemblance, the medallions, the emptiness they both felt. We are sisters, said Victoria, her voice hoarse, as she looked at Maria with new eyes. Maria dropped the letter on the floor. Tears began to roll silently down her cheeks. All this time, I lived alone thinking that no one cared about me, while you were here, so close. Victoria moved closer, but Maria stepped back. You had everything, Victoria. You had parents who loved you, a life of luxury. And me? I've been hungry, cold, abandoned. How do you expect me to accept that? Victoria felt guilt overwhelm her. I didn't know, Maria, but now that I know, I won't leave you alone. We're going to find out the whole truth, together. Maria, still hurt, looked at Victoria for a long moment before finally nodding. That's fine, but that won't erase the past. And at that moment, they both knew that the journey they were about to begin would be painful, but necessary. They were linked by something much bigger than they had imagined, something that would change their lives forever. The Bennett mansion was silent that morning. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, casting golden reflections on the marble floor. Victoria and Maria were sitting in the same room where they had first met, but the air between them was charged with something that neither of them knew how to name. The discovery of the letter had changed everything. Now they knew they were twin sisters, separated when they were babies. Although the revelation had opened a door to something extraordinary, it had also brought with it the weight of the past. Victoria held the letter in her hands while looking at Maria, who remained silent, holding the locket that seemed to be the link between them and the birth mother they had never met. You're not alone, Maria, Victoria finally said, her voice firm but soft. You never were. Maria looked up, her eyes shining with something that was more than sadness. It was hope. I spent so long thinking I had no one, Victoria. I got used to the loneliness, but now I see that life was leading us to this moment. Victoria nodded, feeling a knot forming in her throat. Despite her apparent strength, the impact of the discovery had also hit her deeply. She couldn't help but think of her birth mother, who had made such a painful decision to separate them. How had she survived all those years? And most importantly, where would she be now? We need to find her, said Victoria, determined. We need to know what happened. Maria nodded in agreement. But how? All we have is this letter and what little I remember of the orphanage. Victoria smiled almost imperceptibly. Money may not bring happiness, but it certainly helps to find answers. Over the next few days, Victoria put all her company's resources at the disposal of the search. She hired private detectives, scoured old hospital records, and even reopened investigations that had been closed for decades. Maria, for her part, brought the little information she had about her childhood in the orphanage. Together, they began to connect the dots, revealing a web of sacrifice and loss that seemed larger than either of them had imagined. One afternoon, while they were going over documents in Victoria's office, one of the detectives called. His voice was deep, but it carried a thread of hope. We found something. Your mother, a woman called Rosa Lopez. There are records of her in a villa on the outskirts of Miami. Victoria looked at Maria, who immediately stood up, her hands shaking with anxiety. "When can we go?" Maria asked, her voice full of urgency. "Today," replied Victoria, already grabbing her car keys. The drive to the village was marked by a silence filled with anticipation. The narrow, dusty street seemed to belong to another world, far from the luxury of the Bennett mansion and the busy avenues of Miami. When they finally arrived at the address indicated, they found a small, humble house with peeling walls and a shabby garden. Victoria and Maria got out of the car and approached slowly. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, as if the gravity of the situation was increasing with every moment. Maria held Victoria's hand, and the two exchanged a look that said more than words could express. Victoria knocked on the door, and the sound echoed in the small house. After a few seconds, a woman opened the door. She was slim, with grey hair tied up in a messy bun. Her hands were shaking as she held the door, and her eyes, deep and weathered, quickly turned from Victoria to Maria. "Can I help you?" asked the woman, her voice heavy with fatigue. Maria stepped forward, her heart in her mouth. "Are you Rosa Lopez?" The woman hesitated, her face hardening in a mixture of confusion and caution. "Yes. Who are you?" Victoria held up the letter and held it out to the woman. "We are your daughters." The silence that followed was devastating. Rosa put her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she looked from Maria to Victoria. Her legs weakened, and she held onto the door to stop herself from falling. My girls," she murmured, before collapsing into sobs. Victoria and Maria held her before she fell, carrying her into the house. The interior was simple, almost empty, but the walls were full of old photos and clippings yellowed by time. Rosa sat on a chair, holding the hands of her two daughters as if she was afraid they would disappear. "I thought I would never see them again," Rosa said through tears. "I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I couldn't raise them. I could barely support myself." Maria squeezed her mother's hand, tears streaming down her face. "There's no need to apologize, Mom. We're here now. That's all that matters." Victoria, although emotional, stood her ground. "We want to know the truth, Mom. We want to know why you separated us." Rosa took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. "You were so small. I was alone. Your father abandoned us before you were even born. I had nothing, no money, nowhere to live. When you were born, I knew I couldn't raise you both. I decided to give one of you up for adoption, hoping that at least one of you would have a chance of a better life." Rosa's words cut to the heart of both of them. The sacrifice she had made was immeasurable. "You did what you thought was right, Mom," said Victoria, her voice low but firm. "And for that, I thank you." Maria hugged her mother tightly, feeling that despite everything, she finally had a family. The small room where Rosa lived seemed to freeze in time. The dim light coming through the window barely illuminated the damp-stained walls. Victoria and Maria were sitting next to their biological mother, who was holding their hands as if she feared losing them again. Tears continued to stream down Rosa's face as she tried to organize her words to answer the question that hung in the air. Why had one of her daughters been sent to an orphanage? "When you were born, I was desperate," Rosa began, her voice breaking. She stared at the floor as if looking at her daughters would make the weight of her choices even more unbearable. "There was no one to help me. Your father left me when I was still pregnant. He said he didn't want the responsibility. That I should sort it out." Maria squeezed Rosa's hand, trying to convey support. "Go on, Mom. We want to understand." Rosa took a deep breath, running her hands over her face. "When you were born, everything became even more difficult. I had no home, no steady job. I was living in a neighbor's house, but she made it clear that she couldn't help me for long. So I made the hardest decision of my life." She paused, the weight of the moment evident on her hunched shoulders. "I heard about a rich couple who couldn't have children. I thought that if I gave one of you to them, at least one of you would have a decent life, a chance to grow up in love and comfort." Rosa looked at Victoria, her eyes watering. "That was you, my child." Victoria swallowed. Although she already knew this from the letter, hearing it directly from Rosa was a devastating blow. "And Maria?" she asked, her voice low. Rosa closed her eyes as if to escape the memory. "After you went into foster care, I thought I could take care of Maria. I tried everything. I took on temporary jobs, slept in sheds, starved myself so that she could eat. But when she was only 2, I fell ill. I couldn't work. I couldn't look after her. Maria held the locket around her neck, feeling her mother's pain. "And that's when you left me at the orphanage?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Rosa nodded, the tears flowing again. "It was the cruelest decision I've ever made. I remember the day as if it were yesterday. I took you to that orphanage with the locket around your neck and asked them to take care of you. I knew I couldn't give you anything, but I thought you might have a chance there." The room fell silent, the sound of ragged breaths filling the space. Maria felt a lump in her throat, but there was no anger in her heart, only an emptiness that was now beginning to be filled. "I don't blame you, Mom," Maria said at last. "You did what you thought was best. I grew up without you, but somehow I always felt that there was someone out there who was thinking of me." Rosa burst into tears. Maria got up and hugged her, holding her as if to heal all the wounds of the past. Victoria watched the scene, feeling the impact of the story on her own soul. After a few minutes, Rosa finally managed to calm down. She looked at her daughters, her expression still marked by guilt and grief. "I never stopped thinking about you. Every birthday, every Christmas, I wondered where you were." Victoria, who had remained silent until then, took the floor. "Mom, you don't have to carry this weight alone. We're here now." Rosa looked at Victoria in surprise. "I thought you'd hate me, Victoria, that you would never forgive me for giving you to another family." Victoria shook her head. "How could I hate you? You made an impossible decision, and because of it, I had a life that you could never have given me. It wasn't fair on Maria, but now we have the chance to rebuild what we've lost." Maria looked at Victoria, amazed by her sister's serenity. "She's right, Mom. We're here now, and that's what matters." Rosa smiled, but it was a fragile smile, as if she was still learning to cope with the idea that her daughters had returned to her. Victoria, with her characteristic determination, immediately started making plans. "Mom, you can't go on living here. I'm taking you to the mansion. We'll provide everything you need. Medical care, a comfortable place to live." "No, Victoria, I can't accept that. This isn't my life," Rosa replied hesitantly. Maria intervened. "Mom, you've spent years suffering and fighting. Now it's our turn to take care of you. Please let us do it." After much insistence, Rosa agreed. Victoria arranged for her to be taken to the mansion the next day. However, before they left the village, Rosa made a request. "I want to go back to the orphanage where I left Maria. I have to face it, even if it's painful." The journey to the orphanage was silent. The car drove through narrow, unfamiliar streets, while Rosa kept her gaze fixed on the window, lost in thought. Maria was sitting next to her, holding her hand. When they arrived, the old building seemed to have stood the test of time. The paint was peeling, and the windows were protected by rusty bars. But for Maria, the place was full of memories. They were greeted by the principal, a middle-aged woman who surprisingly remembered Maria. "You were such a sweet child," said the principal, smiling. "You never cried, even when it was clear that you missed something, or someone." Rosa swallowed, feeling the weight of her decision even more strongly. "Thank you for taking care of her when I couldn't," Rosa said, her voice breaking. Maria looked at the principal. "I've always wanted to ask, did my mother leave anything besides the locket? Any letters?" The principal shook her head. "No, dear, just the locket. But I remember her crying when she left you. She said she'd come back one day, but she never did." The words fell like a blow to Rosa's heart. "I wanted to come back, but I never had the courage. I always thought you'd be better off without me," Rosa confessed, bursting into tears again. Maria approached her mother and hugged her tightly. "You did what you thought was right, and now we're together." The journey back to the heart of Miami was silent, but not uncomfortable. In the back seat of the car, Rosa was squeezed between Maria and Victoria, both holding her hands as if to assure her that from now on, she would never face the world alone again. Rosa looked out of the window, the vibrant lights of the city reflecting in her watery eyes. "You're so different, but at the same time so alike," Rosa murmured, breaking the silence. Maria smiled. "I always felt that something was missing in me. Now I understand. You and Victoria were missing." Victoria was not a woman of many words in emotional moments, but she squeezed Rosa's hand, conveying a silent support that said more than any sentence could express. When they arrived at the Bennett mansion, Rosa hesitated as she got out of the car. The imposing facade of the house intimidated her. The wrought iron gates, the impeccable gardens, the grandeur of the building. It all seemed like a world completely alien to her. "I don't know if I belong here," whispered Rosa, looking at her daughters. Victoria took her firmly by the arm, but without losing her tenderness. "Mum, you belong where we are, and now this is your home." The first few days at the mansion were a mixture of wonder and discomfort for Rosa. Although Maria and Victoria did everything they could to make her feel at ease, Rosa couldn't help but feel out of place. The mansion was too big, too luxurious, and Rosa, with her entire life marked by deprivation, didn't know how to deal with it. Maria, on the other hand, seemed to adapt better. Despite her humble origins, she enjoyed every moment with her sister and mother. She liked exploring the house, learning about the details of Victoria's life, and even started helping Donna Berta with the kitchen chores, despite their insistence that she not do so. One afternoon, Maria found Rosa sitting in the garden, under the shade of a large tree. She had her head down, holding the locket that Maria still wore around her neck. "Is everything all right, Mom?" Maria asked, sitting down next to her. Rosa sighed deeply. "It's hard to think of all the things that could have been different. I ask myself every day, what if I had found a way to stay with you? What if I had fought harder?" Maria took her mother's hand and held it lovingly. "Don't torture yourself with the past. You did what you could, Mom. We're here now, and that's what matters." Rosa looked up at Maria, her eyes watering. "You're so good, so generous, even after everything you've been through." "It wasn't easy," Maria admitted. "But somehow I knew that my life was preparing me for something bigger. I think it was preparing me for this moment." The two hugged, and, in the distance, Victoria watched the scene from her office window. Despite being a woman used to making difficult decisions and facing crises in the business world, what was happening there was something that all the money in the world couldn't buy. While life seemed to adjust to the new reality, fate, as always, had more surprises in store. A few days later, one of the detectives hired by Victoria showed up at the mansion with a serious look on his face. He was holding a briefcase, which seemed to weigh more than any document he had brought before. "Mrs. Bennet, I think you and your family need to see this," he said, glancing at Maria and Rosa, who were in the room with Victoria. Victoria frowned, but gestured for him to continue. The detective opened the folder and revealed something no one expected: documents relating to Maria and Victoria's biological father. His name is Daniel Santoro. He was a hard worker, but unfortunately he was an alcoholic at the time he met your mother, and he abandoned the family before you were born, as your mother said. But what we found out is that he's alive and lives in Miami. Rosa put her hand to her heart, as if the words had hit her physically. "He's alive?" Victoria stood up, her face instantly hardening. "And why does that matter? He abandoned us, didn't he? Why should we look for him now?" Maria looked at Victoria, understanding her reaction, but feeling something different in her own heart. "Maybe he's changed, Victoria. Maybe he has something to tell us. Or maybe he's the same cowardly man who left our mother alone," Victoria retorted, crossing her arms. Rosa intervened, her voice still shaky but firm. "Girls, I don't know what he has to say, but I do know that there are things that need to be sorted out. If he's still here, maybe that's a sign." Victoria hesitated, but eventually gave in. "All right then, we'll find him, but don't expect anything from him." 2 days later, Rosa, Victoria, and Maria arrived at the address the detective had given them. It was a luxury condominium in one of Miami's most prestigious areas. Daniel Santoro, it seemed, had prospered, even after abandoning his family. When they reached the door, Rosa hesitated. "I don't know if I can do this." Maria held her mother's hand tightly. "We're with you." Victoria rang the bell, and the sound seemed to echo for eternity. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with impeccably combed grey hair and a look that seemed to carry years of regret. He looked at Rosa first, and his face lost all colour. Then his gaze moved on to Maria and Victoria, and he put his hand to his mouth as if he were facing ghosts. "My daughters," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. Victoria stepped forward, her posture as rigid as a wall. "Yes, we're your daughters. But the question is, what do you have to say for abandoning us?" Daniel took a deep breath, as if he knew that this moment would come someday. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but please let me explain. Rosa seemed paralyzed, unable to take a single step inside. Maria stared at the man she knew to be her father for the first time, trying to decipher something in his expression. Victoria, however, couldn't hide the coldness in his eyes. Daniel invited them in, his voice hesitant and broken, as if he had been taken by surprise by a storm he knew was coming, but for which he had never prepared himself. The apartment was luxurious, decorated with contemporary art pieces and impeccably organized furniture. It was a reflection of a life that had clearly not been marked by the struggles Rosa had faced. Rosa sat on the edge of a sofa, her hands clasped in her lap. Maria chose a nearby armchair while Victoria stood, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Daniel like a silent accusation. He sat opposite them, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his shame. "I never thought I'd have the chance to see you," Daniel began, his voice low and charged with emotion. "And looking at you now, I know I don't deserve it." Victoria was the first to reply, her voice as sharp as a blade. "So why did you agree to see us? Why are you looking at us with that face of belated regret? We're not children in need of consolation, Mr. Santoro. We are women who have survived without you." Maria glanced at her sister, asking for calm, but Victoria didn't take her attention away from Daniel. He swallowed, lowering his eyes. "You're right to hate me," he said, looking back at Rosa. "There's no excuse for what I did. I was young, ambitious, selfish and sick. When I heard you were pregnant, Rosa, I panicked. I didn't know how to deal with the responsibility. I was more concerned with living or surviving one day after the other. Alcohol at that time was my only way out. I couldn't be stronger than him." Rosa took a deep breath, tears gathering in her eyes. "You left me alone, Daniel. I had no one, and yet I tried to raise our daughters as best I could, but I couldn't. I suffered all those years not knowing how they were and whether they hated me." He nodded, his expression tinged with guilt. "I found out years later that you had given one of them up for adoption and that you hadn't been able to keep the other. I thought about looking for them, but I convinced myself that maybe it was for the best, that I'd done enough damage." Victoria couldn't help the short, bitter laugh that escaped her lips. "So you just decided to move on. You left my mother in misery. You left Maria in an orphanage, and me in the hands of strangers. And you thought that was for the best." Daniel looked at her, and for a moment there seemed to be no words in his throat. "No, Victoria, I didn't think it was best. I thought it was the only way not to make things worse. I was a coward. There's no excuse for that." Maria finally intervened, her soft voice contrasting with the tension that dominated the room. "We're here now. We can't change the past. But you owe us the truth. Why didn't you ever come back? Why didn't you ever look for us?" He took a deep breath, looking at the floor before answering. "The truth is that I lacked the courage. I knew where Rosa was. I knew about you. But I convinced myself that there was no room for me in your life. And in the meantime, I went about building my life, trying to forget. But I never forgot. Not even for a day." Maria lowered her eyes, feeling a confused mixture of pity and indignation. Rosa, for her part, seemed lost in her own thoughts, the weight of Daniel's words echoing in her mind. Victoria, however, was in no mood to smooth things over. "Do you have any idea what your absence has cost us? What it cost our mother?" Daniel raised his head, the tears streaming silently down his face. "I know, Victoria, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." Silence once again dominated the room. Maria looked at Rosa, who was now wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "What do you feel, Mom?" Maria asked, her voice full of care. Rosa took a deep breath before answering. "I feel that part of me wants to forgive him, because I can't spend the rest of my life hating him, but another part of me is still attached to that young girl who was abandoned, who had no one to help her." Daniel got up and knelt in front of Rosa, holding her hands carefully. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but if you allow me, I want to try to be someone in your life now. In your lives." Victoria huffed, crossing her arms more tightly. "Convenient, isn't it? Now that everything is more comfortable for you, you want to try?" Maria turned to her sister, her voice firm but gentle. "Victoria, we're all broken in some way. Maybe it's time to rebuild." Victoria closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. As much as she wanted to reject the idea, she knew Maria was right. There was something stronger there, an opportunity for healing, however painful. Daniel stood up and looked at the three women in front of him. I know it won't be easy, but if you give me a chance, I want to show you that I'm a different man now. Rosa stood up slowly, still hesitant, but held out her hand to Daniel. I'm going to try, but it won't happen overnight. Maria, her eyes watering, also nodded. Victoria remained silent for a long moment before finally giving in. I'm not going to trust you right away, but for Maria's sake and for our mother's sake, I'm willing to take things one step at a time. The relief on Daniel's face was visible, but he knew he still had a long way to go. By the time the three women left the apartment, night had fallen over Miami, and the city lights were shining brightly. In the car, Rosa looked at her daughters, feeling something she hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. We're together now, she said, squeezing Maria and Victoria's hands. And that's what matters. Maria smiled, while Victoria looked thoughtfully at the window. Despite everything, there was a subtle sparkle in her eyes, as if the future was finally opening up to something new. The night in Miami was warm, but the sea breeze carried a coolness that softened the heat. Daniel Santoro was sitting on his balcony, looking out at the illuminated city skyline. The conversation with Rosa, Maria, and Victoria still resonated in his mind. Every word, every look, was etched in his memory, like a constant echo of regret. He held a picture frame in his hands, an old yellowed photo of Rosa that he had taken at the beginning of their relationship. At the time, Daniel was a man full of dreams, but addiction led him down a dark path that he couldn't get out of. Rosa was everything he didn't know he needed, strong, kind, passionate about life. But when she announced she was pregnant, he didn't know how to handle the news. Instead of facing the situation, he ran away. This decision had haunted him all his life, turning every moment of happiness into a cruel reminder of his failure. Daniel never wanted another woman after Rosa. Despite his charming looks and young age, he always kept people at a distance. The guilt he carried was an invisible wall that prevented him from getting close to anyone. He told himself that he didn't deserve to be happy while Rosa and the daughters he had abandoned lived without him. But now, after meeting them again, Daniel felt he might have a chance at redemption. He didn't know if he could win Rosa's or his daughter's forgiveness, but he had to try. The following days were marked by small gestures of closeness. Daniel began sending messages to Maria, noticing that she was the most receptive of the three. His messages were simple, but full of intent. He wanted to get to know her better, to understand how she had become the strong and compassionate woman she was. Maria, with her generous heart, responded to the messages. She wasn't naive. She knew that Daniel was trying to get closer, but she sensed that he was sincere. And despite everything, she believed that people could change. You know, Dad, Maria wrote in a message one evening, I grew up in an orphanage. I saw so many children who never had a chance. Maybe you and I can do something for them. Daniel read the message again and again. Maria's words sparked something in him, an idea that began to take shape. A few days later, Daniel invited Maria to dinner. He wanted to share what he had been thinking, but he also wanted to spend more time with her, to build a relationship that they had never had. I thought about what you said about helping children, he began, as the two of them dined in a quiet restaurant by the sea. I want to create a project, something big, a place where abandoned children can receive not only shelter, but also education, emotional support, a real chance of a better future. Maria smiled, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. That would be incredible, Dad, and I want to help you. The word father still sounded like a miracle to Daniel's ears. He held Maria's hand over the table, feeling grateful for the opportunity she was giving him. Thank you, Maria. I don't know if I deserve your trust, but I promise that I will dedicate myself to this with everything I have. The project began to come to life. Daniel used his resources to buy a plot of land in a quiet area of Miami, and Maria was by his side every step of the way. Together they chose the name, La Casa de Esperanza. The place would be a refuge for children who, like Maria, had been left behind, but also a space where they could find love and opportunities. When Rosa heard about the project, something inside her changed. She spent days reflecting, remembering every difficult moment she had faced while trying to look after Maria and Victoria on her own. The idea of helping children in similar situations touched her heart deeply. One day she showed up at the site where Daniel and Maria were supervising the construction. The sound of hammers and excited voices filled the air, but everything stopped when Rosa arrived. Daniel paled at the sight of her, but it was Maria who ran to hug her. "Mom, I'm so glad you came," said Maria, her smile radiant. Rosa looked at Daniel, still hesitant, but finally spoke. "I want to help. I can't change what happened in the past, but maybe I can do something for these children now." Daniel felt his eyes fill with tears. He didn't expect Rosa to forgive him, but the simple fact that she wanted to be there, wanted to be part of the project, was more than he could ask for. As the days turned into weeks, the project progressed rapidly. Rosa started working in the kitchen at Casa de Esperanza, preparing meals for the children. Maria taught sewing and handicrafts, while Daniel took care of the administration and fundraising to keep the project running. Victoria, however, still remained on the sidelines. She visited the site from time to time, observing everything from afar. She saw the children playing, heard the laughter, but couldn't get involved. Something inside her still resisted forgiving Daniel. One afternoon, while Victoria was walking through the gardens of the House of Hope, Maria approached her. "Why don't you join us, Victoria? Your presence here would make such a difference." Victoria shook her head, looking away. "It's not that simple, Maria. You can forgive him, but I still can't." Maria held her sister's hand, her voice full of affection. "He's trying, Victoria, and it's not just for him. It's for these children. Think of the good we're doing together." Victoria looked at Maria, sensing the passion in her eyes. "Maybe one day," she replied, her voice softer than usual. The weeks turned into months, and the House of Hope was finally officially inaugurated, even though it had been up and running before. The ceremony was simple, but full of emotion. Children ran through the newly painted corridors, and laughter filled the space. Daniel, Rosa, and Maria stood in front of the building, smiling at the cameras of local journalists who had come to cover the event. Victoria watched from a distance, her heart divided between pride and resistance. When she saw Daniel kneel down to talk to one of the children, something inside her began to break. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive him, but at that moment she realized that he was trying to be the man he should have been from the start. Daniel looked at Rosa and Maria beside him, and then at Victoria, who was still watching from afar. He knew that Victoria's forgiveness would be the hardest thing to win, but he was willing to wait, because for the first time in decades, he had hope. As night fell over Miami, the lights of Casa de Esperanza illuminated the space like a beacon of hope amidst the silence of the city. Daniel watched the children running around the newly built courtyard, their laughter echoing throughout the place. It was a sound he had never imagined hearing so close to him. He was standing at the main entrance, his hands in his pockets, while the soft evening wind caressed his face. Rosa was in the kitchen, finishing organizing the meals for the next day, but her mind was elsewhere. Ever since she had started working at the House of Hope, she had felt a constant mixture of relief and guilt. There were times when she believed she was finally helping in some way, but at other times the weight of the past came flooding back. Maria entered the kitchen with a warm smile. "Mom, are you okay?" Rosa looked at her daughter, her eyes tired but gentle. "Yes, just thinking about all this, how life has changed so much." Maria pulled up a chair and sat down next to her mother. "You've done so much for these children. They love you already." Rosa smiled softly. "Maybe they do, but sometimes I wonder if that's enough." Maria held her mother's hand. "The past is behind us, Mom. Now we're here together, helping those in need. That's what matters." Rosa nodded, but before she could reply, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He hesitated when he saw them, but Rosa, for the first time, beckoned him in. "Come in, Daniel. I think we need to talk." The silence that followed was dense, but not hostile. Daniel sat down in the chair opposite them, leaning his elbows on the table, his hands intertwined. "I know my place here is still fragile," he began, looking directly at Rosa. "But seeing you here, doing so much for these children, it gives me the strength to carry on." Rosa looked at him, her eyes reflecting years of pain, but also a trace of tenderness that she had held in for so long. "You're their father, Daniel. That won't change, but what we need to build now is trust." Daniel nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I know I'll never be able to make up for everything I've done, but I promise that I will dedicate the rest of my life to doing something that means something." "Maria," who was observing the interaction between the two, noticed a softness in her mother's gaze that she had never seen before. It was as if Rosa was gradually finding a way to forgive, even if it was a long journey. The next morning, Victoria showed up at Casa de Esperanza. She walked around the place like a discreet visitor, her eyes attentive to every detail. She watched the children playing in the courtyard, the volunteers helping with activities, and the impact that her family's work was beginning to have. Maria met her in the main corridor. "I knew you'd come," said Maria, smiling. Victoria sighed, crossing her arms. "I didn't come to stay. I just wanted to see what you've been doing here." Maria didn't press, but there was something in her expression that indicated hope. "I know it's hard, Victoria, but maybe one day you'll find your place here too." Victoria looked away, but she couldn't hide the sparkle in her eyes. "We'll see." Meanwhile, Daniel was in his makeshift office, organizing the House of Hope's financial papers. He was so focused that he didn't hear Rosa come in. She stood in the doorway for a few seconds, watching him, before finally speaking. "I see you're taking this seriously." Daniel raised his head, surprised but grateful for her presence. It couldn't be otherwise. "This place is my chance to try and put things right." Rosa approached, crossing her arms. "I still don't know how I feel about all this, about us, but I can see that you're trying, and that means something." Daniel smiled slightly, a rare expression on his weathered face. "I don't expect anything else, Rosa, only what you're willing to give me." She looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Let's see where this takes us." The weeks passed, and Casa de Esperanza began to gain recognition in the local community. Reporters came to do stories, companies started making donations, and the number of children being cared for increased daily. Daniel and Maria worked tirelessly, while Rosa became a mother figure to the children, often finding solace in their laughter and hugs. Victoria, on the other hand, remained distant, although she visited the place more often. She watched everything from afar, as if trying to find something that would convince her to get involved. One evening, while everyone was getting ready to leave, Victoria found Daniel alone in the courtyard. He was sitting on a bench, looking up at the stars. "It's late. You should go home," said Victoria, her voice calm but firm. Daniel looked up at her and smiled slightly. "Sometimes I feel like this place is more like home than my empty apartment." Victoria hesitated but eventually sat down next to him. "You've lived alone for a long time, haven't you?" Daniel nodded. "Ever since I left Rosa, I've never been able to open up to anyone else. Not after her." Victoria looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "So why didn't you try to go back before?" Daniel took a deep breath, looking at the floor. "I was afraid of facing everything I'd left behind, and perhaps afraid that she had already moved on." Victoria remained silent for a moment before finally speaking. "I don't know if I can forgive you, not yet, but I can see that you're trying, and that means something." Daniel looked at her surprised but said nothing. He knew that those words were the most he could expect from Victoria at the moment. Little by little, the bonds between them began to strengthen. It wasn't an easy or quick process, but it was real. And for the first time in decades, they all felt that they were finally getting closer to something that could be called a family. The sunset tinted the Miami sky in shades of orange and pink, and the House of Hope was filled with the laughter and voices of children playing. Victoria was there again, walking around the courtyard, observing everything from afar. As always, her posture was impeccable, her gaze steady, but there was something different that day. A restlessness she couldn't explain was taking hold of her heart. She approached a small circle where some children were drawing. Her eyes were drawn to a little girl with dark hair and big, bright eyes, who seemed to be concentrating on drawing something on a crumpled piece of paper. Victoria watched for a few seconds before approaching. "What are you drawing?" she asked, her voice coming out softer than she expected. The girl looked up and smiled shyly. "It's a house," she said, holding up the paper for Victoria to see. Victoria gently picked up the drawing. It was a simple house, but full of color. Next to it, the girl had drawn 3 people holding hands with her. "Who are these people?" asked Victoria, curious. The girl pointed to each figure with her finger. "That's me, and these are my parents." Victoria felt a squeeze in her heart when she heard that. "Your parents?" The girl nodded, but her bright eyes became slightly sad. "I've never met them, but I always draw like this, because when I close my eyes at night I want to dream that they're with me." Victoria felt a pang in her chest. Before she could answer, the girl looked at her with a seriousness that seemed unusual for someone so young. "You're sad, aren't you?" Victoria was surprised by the question. "Why do you think that?" The girl tilted her head as if she were an adult trying to understand something complicated. "Because you look at people as if you want to be with them, but you're afraid. I think that if you love someone, you have to stay close even if it's hard, because if you don't, it might be too late." The girl's words struck Victoria like a bolt of lightning. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't say anything. That child, with her simplicity and innocence, had said something that Victoria avoided admitting to herself. "How do you know that?" Victoria whispered, her eyes watering. The girl smiled softly. "Because I know what it's like to feel alone." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face before she could control them. The girl stood up and, without hesitation, hugged her. The gesture broke something inside Victoria, and she cried openly, hugging the girl tightly. That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. The girl's words echoed in her mind. She thought of her mother, Rosa, who had fought alone. She thought of Daniel, who, despite his mistakes, was trying to win back his family. She thought of Maria, who had always believed in the power of forgiveness. The next morning, Victoria made a decision. She got ready and went to the House of Hope, where she found Rosa, Daniel, and Maria gathered in the makeshift office. Without warning, she walked in, interrupting their conversation. "I want to talk to you," she said, her voice firm but charged with emotion. The three of them looked at her in surprise. Victoria took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of hurt and resistance finally fall away. "I was blind for a long time," she began, looking at Rosa. "Mom, you did everything you could, and I never thanked you for it. You gave us a chance even when it seemed impossible." Rosa began to cry, but Victoria continued, now turning to Daniel. "And you? I thought I would never forgive you, but you've changed, and that's clear to everyone. I don't want to live with this weight anymore. I want to try to be your daughter if you still want that." Daniel put his hands to his face, too moved to respond. Rosa held his hand, while Maria smiled, tears streaming down her face. Victoria turned to Maria, her voice breaking. "And you, Maria, but you always believed in what I couldn't see. Thank you for never giving up on me." Maria ran to hug her, and Rosa and Daniel joined in, forming a tight circle of love and reconciliation. After that day, Victoria made another decision that would change her life forever. She returned to the House of Hope and looked for the girl who had spoken so deeply to her heart. "Do you want to come and live with me?" Victoria asked with a soft smile. The girl looked at her in surprise, but then her face lit up. "Really?" Victoria nodded. "I want to give you the home and family you've always dreamed of." The girl jumped into her arms and, for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt that her life was complete. The following months were transformative. Rosa and Daniel became inseparable, rediscovering the love they had lost in the past. Maria divided her time between Victoria's company and her work at Casa de Esperanza, where she continued to help children find new paths. Casa de Esperanza grew even more, gaining notoriety in Miami and attracting volunteers from all over. Together, as a united and strengthened family, they decided to expand the project to other cities, committed to changing the lives of as many children as possible. And in the midst of all this, Victoria finally found peace. With her new daughter by her side, her family reconciled and a renewed purpose. She knew that, despite all the suffering, love and forgiveness had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. If you enjoyed this moving story full of twists and turns, don't forget to leave your rating in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Also, take the opportunity to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss anything new. And before you leave, check out the video that's appearing on your screen right now. It's a story you'll love.